It was a bright Monday morning, and the school hallways were alive with the usual buzz of students chattering, lockers slamming, and teachers trying to maintain some semblance of order. Among the students navigating their way to class was Aaliyah, a soft-spoken but confident 16-year-old who had just started at this new school a few weeks ago. Aaliyah had always been taught by her parents to hold her head high and speak her truth, even when the world around her seemed unfair. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. As she walked into her history class that morning, she noticed the usual setup. The desks were arranged in neat rows, and the chalkboard had a list of topics written in bold letters. At the front of the room stood Mr. Patterson, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a reputation for being strict, but fair, or so Aaliyah had heard. "Good morning, class," Mr. Patterson said, his voice cutting through the hum of whispers. "Today, we'll be discussing significant historical movements. Open your books to page 137. Aaliyah flipped open her book, eager to learn. History was her favorite subject, and she always enjoyed engaging in discussions about the past. But as the lesson progressed, something began to feel off. Mr. Patterson started talking about civil rights, but instead of the respect and depth Aaliyah was used to hearing about, his tone carried an unmistakable edge. The words he used seemed dismissive, almost mocking. At first, Aaliyah tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just having a bad day. Maybe she was misinterpreting his tone. But then, it happened. Mr. Patterson made a comment, one so blatantly offensive that the room fell silent. Aaliyah could feel the eyes of her classmates darting toward her, but she kept her gaze steady on the teacher, her hands clenched into fists under the desk. "Some people," Mr. Patterson said with a smirk, "think they can rewrite history to make themselves seem more important than they really are. Isn't that right, Aaliyah?" Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what he meant. Her classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away, others glancing at her with a mixture of pity and nervousness. The air in the room grew heavy with tension. For a moment, Aaliyah didn't know what to do. Should she speak up? Should she stay quiet and let it slide? Her mind raced with thoughts of her parents' advice, the values they had instilled in her, and the stories of resilience they had shared with her since she was a child. And then, something inside her clicked. Aaliyah raised her hand. Her voice was steady, but filled with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "Mr. Patterson," she began, her words slicing through the silence, "can I ask you a question?" The teacher raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to respond. "Go ahead," he said, leaning against his desk with a smug expression. And just like that, Aaliyah said something that no one in that room would ever forget. "Mr. Patterson," Aaliyah said again, her voice calm, but with a confidence that caught everyone off guard. "Why do you think history only belongs to some people and not to everyone?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Mr. Patterson blinked, his smug demeanor faltering for just a moment. The room was so silent that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed deafening. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, straightening up and crossing his arms. There was a hint of defensiveness in his tone now, as if Aaliyah's question had struck a nerve he wasn't prepared to face. Aaliyah's heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew she had to tread carefully, not just for herself, but for everyone else in the room who might have felt the sting of his words but didn't know how to respond. She began, her words measured and deliberate. "History isn't about making anyone more or less important. It's about telling the truth, and the truth doesn't change just because it makes some people uncomfortable." Her classmates exchanged glances, some of them nodding subtly, others looking back at Mr. Patterson to see how he would respond. Aaliyah could feel their silent support, even if they weren't ready to speak up themselves. Mr. Patterson let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, that's a very idealistic way of looking at things, Aaliyah," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But the real world doesn't work that way. People write history to serve their own agendas. That's just the way it is." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe," she replied. "But doesn't that make it even more important for us to question those agendas? To make sure we're not just repeating what we've been told without thinking about who's telling the story and why?" The class was completely engrossed now. Even the students who usually zoned out during lectures were sitting up straight, their eyes darting between Aliyah and Mr. Patterson like they were watching a tennis match. Mr. Patterson seemed to realize that he was losing control of the room. His face reddened slightly, and he leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Listen, young lady, I've been teaching history for longer than you've been alive. I think I know a bit more about it than you do." Aliyah felt a wave of anger rise within her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she took a deep breath and replied, "You're right, Mr. Patterson. You probably do know more about history than I do. But I'm still learning, and I want to learn the truth, not just one version of it." The room buzzed with quiet murmurs. It was clear that Aliyah's words had struck a chord with her classmates. Some of them were nodding in agreement, while others stared at her with a mix of awe and curiosity. Mr. Patterson, however, was not impressed. He slammed his hand on the desk, silencing the murmurs instantly. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "This is my classroom, and I won't have a student disrespecting me like this." Aliyah flinched at his outburst but quickly recovered. She wasn't trying to disrespect him. She was just trying to stand up for what she believed in. But now she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. Would anyone else say something? Or would she have to carry this fight alone? Before she could say anything else, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students began gathering their things, but the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Aliyah stayed seated, her eyes locked on Mr. Patterson. She wasn't done yet, and she could tell that he wasn't either. As her classmates shuffled out of the room, a few of them gave her small, encouraging smiles. One girl even whispered, "You're so brave," as she passed by. But Aliyah barely registered their words. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. When the room was nearly empty, Mr. Patterson called out, "Aliyah, stay behind for a moment." Her stomach tightened, but she nodded and remained in her seat. Once the last student had left, Mr. Patterson closed the door and turned to face her. "Do you have any idea how disruptive your behavior was today?" he demanded, his voice low but no less intimidating. Aliyah met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I wasn't trying to be disruptive," she said. "I was just asking questions. Isn't that what learning is supposed to be about?" Mr. Patterson let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's a time and place for questions, Aliyah. And the way you spoke to me in front of the class was completely out of line." Aliyah frowned. "So, it's out of line to ask for the truth." "The truth," he snapped, "is that you're a student and I'm the teacher. You need to remember your place." His words stung, but Aliyah didn't let them break her resolve. "I'm sorry if I came across as disrespectful," she said, her tone firm but polite. "That wasn't my intention. I just think it's important for all of us to have these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable." Mr. Patterson stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You're a smart girl, Aliyah, but you've got a lot to learn about how the world works." Aliyah stood up, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Maybe I do," she said. "But I also think the world has a lot to learn from people like me." With that, she turned and walked out of the classroom, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Mr. Patterson, or anyone else, silence her voice. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed a small group of her classmates waiting for her. One of them, a boy named Marcus, stepped forward and said, "Hey, that was amazing what you did back there." Aliyah smiled, grateful for their support. "Thanks," she said. But this isn't over yet. And she was right. What happened next would change everything, not just for Aliyah, but for the entire school. The rest of the day felt like a blur for Aliyah. Though she tried to focus on her other classes, her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation with Mr. Patterson. It wasn't just his words that bothered her. It was the way he seemed so certain, so unapologetic, as if he believed he could never be questioned. At lunch, Aliyah sat with Marcus and a few other students who had witnessed what happened. They seemed just as shaken as she was, but their curiosity outweighed their fear. "Do you think he's going to try to get back at you?" Marcus asked, his voice low as he glanced around the cafeteria. "I don't know," Aliyah admitted. "But I'm not going to let him intimidate me." What he said wasn't okay, and someone had to call him out. A girl named Sophie leaned in, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You're braver than me. I wouldn't have been able to say anything." Aaliyah shook her head. "It's not about being brave. It's about doing what's right. If we let stuff like this slide, it's just going to keep happening." Sophie nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "Still, you've got to be careful. Teachers like Mr. Patterson, they don't like being challenged. He might try to make things harder for you." Aaliyah sighed, knowing Sophie was probably right, but what choice did she have? Staying silent wasn't an option. As the days went on, the tension between Aaliyah and Mr. Patterson grew. He didn't say anything overtly cruel, but his attitude toward her was noticeably colder. He would barely acknowledge her in class, and when she raised her hand to ask a question, he often ignored her. But Aaliyah wasn't alone. More and more students began to rally behind her, sharing their own stories about times they felt dismissed or disrespected by Mr. Patterson. Marcus even suggested starting a petition to address the issue with the school administration. "I think it's time we did something bigger," he said one afternoon as they sat in the library, brainstorming ideas. "This isn't just about you, Aaliyah. This is about all of us." Aaliyah agreed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that standing up to someone like Mr. Patterson wouldn't be easy. He was a respected teacher, with years of experience and a reputation for being tough but knowledgeable. Would anyone in the administration even believe them? That night, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table with her parents, recounting everything that had happened. Her mom listened intently, her brow furrowed, while her dad paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You did the right thing speaking up," her mom said firmly. "But we need to make sure you're protected. This could get complicated." Her dad nodded in agreement. "If this teacher has a history of this kind of behavior, the school needs to know about it. But we need to be smart about how we approach this." Aaliyah felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She was grateful for their support, but the weight of what lay ahead felt heavier than ever. The next day, Marcus approached her in the hallway, holding a folder filled with papers. "I've been doing some digging," he said quietly, pulling her aside. "I talked to some of the older students, and it turns out Mr. Patterson's had complaints filed against him before. Nothing ever came of it, but it's not the first time he's been accused of being biased." Aaliyah's eyes widened, seriously. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I think if we can gather enough stories, we might have a real case. But we need more people to come forward." It was a daunting task, but Aaliyah knew they had to try. Over the next few days, she and Marcus worked tirelessly, speaking to classmates, organizing meetings, and encouraging others to share their experiences. Slowly but surely, the stories began to pour in. One student, a quiet boy named Jamal, shared how Mr. Patterson had once made a snide remark about his handwriting, comparing it to graffiti. Another girl, Emily, talked about how he often dismissed her questions, even when they were relevant to the lesson. As the list of grievances grew, so did their determination. But with each step forward, the pushback became stronger. One morning, Aaliyah was called into the principal's office. She sat across from Mrs. Cunningham, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression. "I've been hearing some things, Aaliyah," Mrs. Cunningham began, folding her hands on the desk. "It seems there's been some tension in your history class." Aaliyah took a deep breath. "Yes, ma'am. I believe Mr. Patterson's behavior towards some of his students, including me, has been inappropriate. We're trying to bring attention to it." Mrs. Cunningham's lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand that you feel strongly about this, but I need to remind you that Mr. Patterson is a valued member of our staff. Accusations like this can be very serious." "They should be serious," Aaliyah replied, her voice steady. "Because what he's doing isn't right." Mrs. Cunningham studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I'll look into it," she said finally. "But I need you to understand that these things take time. And in the meantime, I expect you to remain respectful and focused on your studies." Aaliyah nodded, but as she left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that her words had fallen on deaf ears. The days that followed were some of the hardest Aaliyah had ever faced. Whispers followed her through the hallways, and some students began to distance themselves, afraid of getting caught up in the controversy. But Marcus, Sophie, and a handful of others stayed by her side, their resolve unwavering. One afternoon, as they were finalizing the petition, Sophie glanced up and said, "Do you think we'll actually make a difference, or are we just wasting our time?" Aaliyah looked around at her friends, the weight of their efforts evident on their faces. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if we don't try, nothing will ever change." And so, they kept going, even as the obstacles grew. What none of them realized was that the fight they had started was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. Over the next few days, the school buzzed with whispers about the petition and the growing tension between Aaliyah and Mr. Patterson. It seemed like everyone had an opinion, but not all of them were supportive. Some students said Aaliyah was being dramatic, that she should just let it go and focus on her studies. Others thought she was brave for standing up to someone like Mr. Patterson. The petition had gained traction, with more signatures than Aaliyah and Marcus expected. Students who had never spoken up before started sharing their own stories about Mr. Patterson. Some of the experiences were subtle, quiet instances of disrespect that were easy to overlook, but when pieced together, they painted a clear picture. This wasn't just about one comment or one student. It was a pattern, and it had been going on for years. But with every step forward, the pushback grew stronger. One morning, Aaliyah arrived at school to find a note taped to her locker. The words were scrawled in thick black marker, * mind your own business *. Her stomach churned as she read it, but she refused to let fear win. She ripped the note off her locker and crumpled it in her hand, determined not to show anyone how much it rattled her. But as she walked to class, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for her to back down. Later that day, as Aaliyah was walking to the library with Marcus, they noticed Mr. Patterson standing in the hallway, talking to another teacher. His eyes briefly met Aaliyah's, and she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his expression, something cold and calculating, that made her uneasy. "Do you think he knows about the petition?" Marcus whispered, keeping his voice low. Aaliyah nodded. "He probably does, but we're not doing anything wrong. He can't stop us." Still, the tension was undeniable. Every time Aaliyah walked into history class, she could feel the weight of Mr. Patterson's gaze on her. His lectures became sharper, his tone more dismissive. He stopped calling on her altogether, even when she knew the answers. It was as if he was trying to erase her presence in his classroom. But Aaliyah wouldn't be silenced. One afternoon, after a particularly tense class, she stayed behind, determined to confront him. As the other students filed out, she approached his desk. "Mr. Patterson," she began, her voice steady, "I think we need to talk." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "About what?" he asked coolly. "You know what," she replied. "The way you've been treating me and other students, it's not okay. We deserve to be treated with respect." Mr. Patterson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Respect is earned, Miss Johnson. And quite frankly, your behavior hasn't exactly been respectful." Aaliyah's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "Asking questions and standing up for myself isn't disrespectful," she said firmly. "It's what you taught us to do. At least, that's what I thought history was about. Challenging narratives and seeking the truth." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might actually listen. But then he leaned forward, his tone low and sharp. "Be careful, Aaliyah. You don't want to make things harder for yourself." Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her hands trembling. She didn't know what his next move would be, but she had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. The turning point came later that week, when the school announced an emergency assembly. The entire student body gathered in the auditorium, the air thick with anticipation. Whispers filled the room as students speculated about what was going on. As Aaliyah took her seat near the front, Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Do you think this is about us?" "Maybe," Aaliyah replied, her stomach churning. "But I guess we're about to find out." The principal, Mrs. Cunningham, stepped onto the stage, her expression grave. She waited for the room to quiet down before speaking. "Students, I've called this assembly to address some concerns that have been brought to my attention," she began, her voice calm but firm. It's come to light that there have been allegations of inappropriate behavior by a member of our faculty. These allegations are being taken very seriously, and an investigation is underway." The room erupted in whispers. Aaliyah's heart raced as she glanced at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod. Mrs. Cunningham continued, "In the meantime, I want to remind everyone that this is a learning environment where respect and open dialogue are valued. If any student has concerns, my door is always open." As the assembly ended and students began filing out, Aaliyah felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The administration was finally taking notice, but she knew this was just the beginning. Whatever happened next would determine not just her future, but the future of every student who had spoken up. In the days that followed, tensions reached a boiling point. Mr. Patterson remained silent about the investigation, but his demeanor in class was icier than ever. Aaliyah could feel the pressure mounting, but she also felt a growing sense of determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. And she wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. What she didn't realize was that the truth would come out in a way no one could have predicted, leaving the entire school reeling. The days after the assembly were filled with a charged energy that seemed to ripple through every corner of the school. Conversations were quieter, more guarded, but there was an undeniable tension that lingered in the hallways and classrooms. Aaliyah could feel it, and she knew the investigation had everyone on edge, especially Mr. Patterson. But just when it seemed like things might start to calm down, a shocking discovery sent everything spiraling into chaos. It started with Marcus. He had been scrolling through social media one evening when he stumbled upon a thread that stopped him cold. "Aaliyah, you need to see this," he said the next morning, pulling her aside before class. He held up his phone, his face pale. On the screen was a post from an anonymous student who claimed to have overheard a conversation between Mr. Patterson and another teacher. According to the post, Mr. Patterson had been venting about the investigation, calling it a witch hunt and blaming Aaliyah by name. The post also hinted that he was considering taking legal action, accusing her of defamation. Aaliyah stared at the screen, her stomach twisting into knots. "This can't be real," she whispered, but the sinking feeling in her chest told her otherwise. Marcus frowned. "Even if it's not, people are already talking about it. Look at the comments." Sure enough, the post had sparked a flurry of reactions. Some students defended Aaliyah, calling her brave for standing up to Mr. Patterson. Others sided with him, accusing her of exaggerating and stirring up trouble. The divide was growing, and it was clear that the situation was far from under control. That afternoon, as Aaliyah walked into history class, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Mr. Patterson stood at the front of the room, his face unreadable, but his eyes flicked to her for a brief moment before he started the lesson. The class dragged on, every word he spoke laced with an underlying tension. When the bell finally rang, Aaliyah gathered her things quickly, hoping to avoid any confrontation. But as she stepped into the hallway, she was met by a group of students who had clearly been waiting for her. "You think you can just ruin a teacher's life and get away with it?" one of them said, their voice low but laced with anger. Aaliyah froze, her heart pounding. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone's life," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just standing up for what's right." The students scoffed. "Right, because you're such a hero. Maybe you should think about how this is affecting everyone else." Before Aaliyah could respond, Marcus appeared at her side, his expression protective. "Leave her alone," he said firmly, stepping between her and the group. The students glared but didn't push further, eventually walking away with muttered insults trailing behind them. Aaliyah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "This is getting out of control," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, but we're not backing down. You've come too far to let them scare you now." As the days went on, the situation continued to escalate. More students came forward with stories about Mr. Patterson, some of them dating back years. The weight of their testimonies was impossible to ignore, and it seemed like the tide might finally be turning. But just when it seemed like the truth was on the verge of coming out, a second twist shook everything. During a routine staff meeting, A former teacher who had retired the previous year submitted an anonymous letter to the administration. The letter claimed that Mr. Patterson had not only exhibited biased behavior in the classroom, but had also actively suppressed students' voices when they tried to speak out. The revelation was explosive. It wasn't just about one student or one incident. It was a systemic issue that had been overlooked for far too long. When the news of the letter leaked, the school was thrown into turmoil. Parents began calling the administration, demanding answers. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, and reporters started showing up outside the school gates. For Aaliyah, it was both validating and overwhelming. On one hand, the letter confirmed what she had always suspected, that this wasn't just her fight. But on the other hand, the sudden media attention brought a new level of scrutiny that she hadn't been prepared for. One evening, as she sat in her room scrolling through her phone, she came across an article about the controversy. Her name wasn't mentioned directly, but it was clear that she was at the center of the storm. She turned off her phone and buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her parents had been supportive, but she could tell they were worried. And while Marcus and Sophie had been by her side through it all, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying the burden alone. The next day, as she walked into school, she noticed a group of reporters gathered near the entrance. Cameras flashed, and questions were shouted, but she kept her head down, refusing to engage. Inside, the atmosphere was even tenser than before. Students whispered in the hallways, teachers avoided eye contact, and the principal's office was a revolving door of meetings and phone calls. Aaliyah knew the climax was coming, that everything they had been fighting for was about to reach a breaking point. But she also knew that the road ahead would be even harder than what they had already faced. As she sat in the library with Marcus and Sophie, she took a deep breath and said, "No matter what happens, we have to see this through. For everyone who's been silenced, for everyone who's been hurt, we can't stop now." They nodded, their determination mirroring her own. And though the path forward was uncertain, one thing was clear: the fight wasn't over yet. The school buzzed with an almost unbearable tension the day the investigation reached its conclusion. A special meeting was called, one where parents, students, and staff were invited to hear the administration's findings. The auditorium was packed to the brim, the air thick with anticipation. Aaliyah sat with Marcus and Sophie near the front, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The principal, Mrs. Cunningham, walked onto the stage, holding a folder that seemed to contain the weight of the world. She took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. Over the past few weeks, our school has faced serious allegations that have required a thorough investigation, she began, her voice steady but solemn. I want to thank everyone who came forward to share their experiences. It is never easy to speak out, but your courage has been instrumental in bringing the truth to light. The crowd was silent, hanging onto her every word. Aaliyah could feel her palms sweating, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this going to end the way she hoped? Mrs. Cunningham continued, after interviewing students, staff, and reviewing evidence, we have determined that there is sufficient proof to substantiate the claims of inappropriate and discriminatory behavior by Mr. Patterson. Effective immediately, Mr. Patterson has been relieved of his duties as a teacher at this school. The room erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Aaliyah felt a rush of relief, her body finally releasing the tension she had been carrying for weeks. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a proud smile, and Sophie squeezed her hand tightly. But Mrs. Cunningham wasn't finished. While this decision addresses one part of the issue, it has become clear that there are deeper, systemic problems that need to be addressed. This is not just about one teacher or one incident. It's about creating an environment where every student feels safe, respected, and valued. To that end, we will be implementing mandatory training for all staff and creating a student advisory board to ensure that your voices are heard moving forward. The crowd murmured again, this time with a mix of approval and hope. Aaliyah felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just a victory for her, it was a step toward meaningful change for everyone. But just as she thought the hardest part was over, a voice called out from the back of the auditorium. It was Mr. Patterson. "This is outrageous," he exclaimed. pushing his way to the front of the room. His face was flushed with anger, his voice shaking with indignation. "I've dedicated years to this school, and this is how you repay me? By throwing me under the bus based on the word of a few students with a grudge." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Alia's heart began to race again. She hadn't expected him to show up, let alone to fight back so publicly. "I've done nothing wrong," Mr. Patterson continued, his voice rising. "This is a witch hunt, plain and simple, and I won't stand for it." Mrs. Cunningham tried to maintain control. "Mr. Patterson, this meeting is not the appropriate place." But before she could finish, another voice spoke up. It was one of the senior students, a boy who had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal. "You did this to yourself," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We all saw how you treated Aaliyah, and we've all seen how you've treated others. You can't hide from the truth anymore." The auditorium was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Mr. Patterson looked around, his defiance faltering as more students began to nod in agreement. One by one, they started speaking up, sharing their own stories and experiences. The floodgates had opened, and there was no turning back. Aaliyah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. This was the moment she had been fighting for, not just accountability, but empowerment. The voices that had been silenced were finally being heard. Mr. Patterson, visibly shaken, muttered something under his breath before storming out of the auditorium. The room erupted into applause, not out of celebration, but out of solidarity. For the first time, it felt like real change was possible. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Marcus turned to Aaliyah. "You did it," he said, his voice full of admiration. "We did it," she corrected, smiling through her tears. But as they walked out of the auditorium, something unexpected happened. Aaliyah's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous account. The subject line read, "Asterisk, you don't know the whole story asterisk." She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Opening the email, she found a single line of text. Asterisk, "There's more to Patterson's actions than you realize. Be careful asterisk." Aaliyah stared at the screen, a chill running down her spine. She thought the fight was over, but it seemed like the story wasn't finished yet.